All right, everyone, welcome to the China lecture. We're going to be covering both some foreign and domestic issues, and our guest lecturer today is going to be the absolutely brilliant Angela Wang. Obviously, the best international extemper on the planet today, won NSDA Nationals, absolutely phenomenal speaker. So yeah, pay attention, maybe take some notes. Just listen. She's going to be giving the first half of the presentation on China FOPO, and I'll be touching on some of their domestic issues as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So that was not true, everything you said, but I am glad to be here today to lecture with you guys. But yeah, okay, so we're going to hop into Chinese foreign policy, which is going to mostly surround the One Belt, One Road initiative or the Belt and Road initiative. So, the Belt and Road Initiative or the BRI. So, the entire premise of the BRI is literally just an international system of infrastructure. And so, as you can see, China is specifically trying to invest this money and trying to build infrastructure in areas that are in parts of the developing world. And so, what are specific reasons you guys think that China would specifically put funding towards developing countries rather than maybe more developed ones? So, what are some possible reasons for that? Power and allies. Uh huh. Resources, higher potential for economic growth, and a catch up effect. Okay, so Shreya, can you kind of explain like what you think about the, or like what the catch up effect means and everything?
Basically, developing countries will grow faster temporarily than developed countries because they have greater potential for growth.
Yeah, interesting, for sure. So, like Arjun was saying, with that potential for economic growth. So, absolutely, you guys are all right with these, whether you talk about the allies like China purposefully allying with developing countries, the fact that they do have higher potential for economic growth. But perhaps the most important reason why China specifically targets developing countries is because the entire scheme of Belt and Road is that they want something out of this, right? If they give billions of dollars to a country, they want to gain leverage ultimately. That's almost the entire reason why countries have economic pursuits. And then Arjun also says, because the US and EU aren't investing in Africa and Asia. Absolutely, that's a really good point, Arjun. So China has identified that these developing regions are maybe ones that under a Trump administration, he hasn't focused as much on. So if there isn't US aid, then clearly China can fill that void. So that's a really good point. So yeah, with developing countries, China knows that they are the most weak, and like Arjun was saying, they are probably going to be most inclined to receive this aid. And therefore, if they're waiting there with open arms, then China knows that it's more leverage because they're more desperate for the aid. And thus, they will do more things to listen to China. So that's why they specifically target developing countries. And like it says, it's infrastructure in specific key trade routes. So China is still obviously targeting regions that are going to be strategically beneficial to them. All right. So the coverage of this, as you can see, it's massive, right? 125 countries, 1.2 to 1.3 trillion dollars across the entire world, 70% of the world's population, and 75% of energy reserves. And that's an interesting point to point out because China has tried to create this image of the BRI as something where they're spearheading sustainable development, as in the energy sources that they create, the infrastructure they create is all like environmentally friendly, and that in the long term, it's good. However, much of that is honestly just lip service. Like in a lot of the places that China is investing, be it Africa or in like different areas of like Asia and everything, the infrastructure and the funding they provide oftentimes leads to more fossil fuels being built. And the reason why is because obviously for developing countries, when that natural resource is way more lucrative for them, it's just a lot more economically sound for China to go towards that rather than like expensive renewable infrastructure. And so that's just something to keep in mind is that though China says that it's going to be really sustainable, it's really renewable and everything, in reality, that's not the case in a lot of cases. Okay, so that probably just, we're not going to look too far into that, but it's probably just like key infrastructure projects across the world. But we're just going to talk about its history. So, unfortunately, it was initially called BARF. not too good, so they changed it to the OBOR in 2013. But then, like it says, China decided that that was threatening, and so now it's the BRI. And so just a little history of why Xi Jinping even started this is because before his administration in China, the Chinese leaders were actually not so set, like not so focused on trying to expand this like hegemonic power. Like China was more so just not so much of an aggressive power, I would say, where they are just like consistently trying to gain more and more leverage like everywhere they go in the world. But they were just more like based on legit like economic relationships and just forging that multilateralism. And yes, Xi Jinping has done that through the BRI. But the underlying pursuit is to expand Chinese hegemonic power. And his administration in particular has done like a lot for China in that sense. So that's why he launched the BRI. Could the Belt and Road Forum be seen as an alternative to NATO or the EU? That's an interesting question. So I would say that the fundamental purpose of the EU, since it's so European-centric, you could make a parallel that now through the Belt and Road, like other countries across the world are now connected with one another, like you could make that connection. But I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a direct alternative just because since the EU is so central to Europe and it's not so much about like their infrastructure connecting, but rather it's like their economic systems, their travel, their like currency, everything like that. So I would say that there's still probably a key difference, and that a lot of times an interesting thing to note is that countries will just double dip, right? Like if there is no restriction that a country can only pick one or the other, then for example, Italy is currently in the Belt and Road, but they're also in the EU. And so I wouldn't say that it's necessarily an alternative, but maybe something that they would just like do both of to get both benefits. Yeah, good question. Okay. All right. So, like we were discussing, why is the Belt and Road so critical to China? So one, like we were saying, it is seen as a zero-sum game, and I would say that in a large sense it is, right? Because like we were saying, if there's only a finite number of countries that want to take aid, oftentimes they will put more, if they're investing time into partnering with China, then that means they're investing less time into partnering with America. So, like it says, undermining American hegemony. So, the United States, when we provide aid, does something that is specifically known as strings attached aid. And that is a term that you guys can very easily use in any speech that you give. Like I would, if anything, tend to use the word strings attached aid a lot when I explain US aid, because it's a very like basic way of explaining a very important concept. And so essentially, when the United States gives aid, it's always conditional, right? They're like, okay, if we're giving aid to this autocratic government, this dictator, you have to first make XYZ reforms in order to get our aid. But if you like break these terms, you no longer get aid. And so obviously, as like a dictator, in their heads, they want the best of both worlds, right? They want aid, but they don't want to make all of these reforms that have to change their power. And so the United States, as a result of like consistently making sure that it's conditional, has lost some of its popularity in terms of the aid that it provides. So like it says, not only that, but also invasions, right? Like in the Middle East, how many countries have we invaded? Constant wars, drone strikes, and like it says, forceful democratic promotions. However, China is like, okay, if you don't want to receive aid from a country that is forcing you to do these things, we won't force you to do anything. And so China has been like, hey, here's billions of dollars worth of aid, but you don't have to do anything. Like you don't have to reform yourself. And so obviously countries are like, wow, China is so nice to me. I'm going to go and take their aid. And so that's how China is unseating us in a lot of places. Like, for example, Africa, we used to have really strong relations there. We're being unseated. And so that is a very big pursuit for China, obviously. We see that in a lot of places in the world, and clearly in the BRI too. Okay, so the second thing is economic objectives. So China is understandably losing a lot of money from the BRI, right? They're pouring trillions of dollars into this, so they want to make sure that whatever they invest in, they are getting something out of it. So one is that, like it says, I'm going to jump to point 3. So the first main economic benefit for China is now that they have a massive consumer base for their goods, right? Because in order to do trade, a really big reason why countries don't have pre-existing trade a lot of times is not only because of like tariffs and taxes, but also because like the transportation is not there, those economic connections are not there. But if China has now constructed like billions of dollars worth of infrastructure like trains and all that stuff, like the connections, then it's far easier for China to now export their manufactured goods into these countries. So one, they've now built a stable consumer base for their goods. And for a country that is based on manufacturing, that is super, super big. Okay, and then fourth point here, it also creates demand in the short term for their steel and cement. And that's something I want to highlight here, which is something that you can include in like any of your speeches and everything. It's like an interesting point of analysis. But a lot of countries, when they bring in China to build infrastructure, are under the idea that, oh, China's going to help our economy because if they're bringing in all of these construction companies to build this infrastructure, then all of our people are going to get hired. But the thing is that oftentimes when Chinese companies, like for example, if they go to like Nigeria or if they go to Pakistan, those Chinese companies are bringing Chinese nationals with them and therefore are only using Chinese people as their source of labor. And so you can definitely see where that's a problem, right? Because for these countries that thought China was going to help their labor and like decrease their unemployment, they didn't, because China just brought their own workers. So the BRI is really, really good for Chinese companies, for Chinese laborers, because they make a lot of money and it creates demand. Okay, so back onto points 1 and 2. So with like the second point there, right? One good thing that the BRI has done, like there are probably not too many catches with this, is that it has alleviated a lot of people from poverty. Environmental protections, that's a little hazy, right? And then engineering sustainability, so just making sure that these poor countries do have like sources of infrastructure is essentially all it means. Okay. So yeah. Yeah, essentially Arjun. Arjun said, displacing native workers while China pockets all the profits. That's a pretty good way to see it. All right. And then the third one is military objectives. So as a massive military power, China obviously has to consider this whenever they do stuff. And so BRI undoubtedly does help them with this. So first is because of the roads, ports, railways allow them to move troops and station their navy. So I don't know if you guys have heard, and we're going to go on to some last point, but Sri Lanka has a port that China now through BRI has obtained, and that port is super, super critical to them militarily and economically. Not only is that region a key part for trade, but also that area is like an ocean in which China needs a lot of military intelligence for, and they want their troops to be there. And so with the BRI, with infrastructure, they're like, hey, let's build you a port. That's helpful infrastructure, but it is essentially just a guise for China to be able to establish more control within the region militarily. So that's the first point. Second is that you can counteract US, right? We're going back to that counteracting US hegemony. So if China can now ensure that people who previously worked with the US now want to work with them, that's a really, really good situation for China. Not only are they gaining in critical intelligence, their biggest military ally is also losing intelligence. Like that is just the perfect situation for them. So, right, if China, once again, we were saying, like it says, if they can offer those incentives or if they can offer economic punishments, then they have to support China militarily, and they can even force them to refuse the US. So the key word that you will hear here that is very important is leverage. Like the BRI is all about leverage. They provide economic aid, leverage. All right. Okay, so like I was saying, Sri Lanka, this is a very key point that is it demonstrates probably the underlying incentive of China doing BRI in a lot of places. So with Sri Lanka, China lended them a lot of money. And like we were establishing in the beginning, they knew that Sri Lanka would have to take that aid and that they were developing, and so they were desperate enough to take it. However, because China is targeting purposefully weaker nations, that means that they know in their heads, like, okay, if I give billions of dollars aid to Sri Lanka, in a couple of years, Sri Lanka probably can't pay back that money because it's too expensive. And so by targeting these weaker countries, Sri Lanka, like China predicted, was unable to pay it back. And so this is where the leverage comes in. China's like, okay, you couldn't pay back our billions of dollars of aid. Let me now, as a result of you not paying it back, I'm going to take parts of your land to compensate. And so they literally took away the port, signed off a lease for 99 years. And now this port, with strategic shipping, with strategic military operations, are completely in the hands of China. So if you think about that, that's not that great of a situation for Sri Lanka, right? All right. So yeah, as a result, the Sri Lankan government is not in the position to contradict China. They have to just listen to the superpower because they've taken all their aid. Another point that I want to highlight here is that another way China gets leverage, if you think about it, is that China no longer has that leverage if countries can pay back the aid, right? And so if all of that infrastructure is incredibly lucrative, like if China builds them a really, really good road that makes Sri Lanka billions of dollars, that means Sri Lanka can pay back that money in a really short period of time, and China doesn't have leverage. Like, what did they gain? Not a lot, right? And so China will oftentimes ensure that the quality of this infrastructure isn't that high. Like, I've read a lot of cases, like whether I think it's like Pakistan and like other countries in Africa, where the quality of the infrastructure itself is so low that China knows that in a couple of years, that infrastructure will be so bad that the country, that it is no longer economically productive. Or in other words, if they have a road that's built and it breaks in a couple of years, Sri Lanka can't make that much money off that road, right? Because it's literally broken. And so purposefully building infrastructure at a lower quality than it should be is another way that China ropes in countries and that makes them, you know, in their grasp and with their leverage. Okay. Any questions with that? No? Okay. So is this domestic, Ryan?
Yeah. This is going to be domestic. So I guess if you want to stop screen sharing, I can try screen sharing.
Sure, okay.
Yeah, wait one sec.
But yeah, if you guys have any questions regarding BRI or like any other part of Chinese foreign policy, just feel free to ask.
Okay. Yes. Feel free to type it. Yeah.
Quick question. So when you said the Chinese government was spending 1.3 to 1.4 trillion, does that really just mean that they're offering like 1.3 to 1.4 trillion in like low interest loans?
Yeah, like the loans themselves. It's not necessarily them like paying a down deposit where like it will be paid back, but they are like loaning that much money, which in a lot of cases won't be paid back. And so in theory they did spend it. But yeah, that wasn't like the money that they spent themselves, but rather ones that they've loaned that sometimes will not be paid back.
Okay, and then just one other thing. So if they're like intentionally creating poor infrastructure, but they want to use that infrastructure to advance their own like geopolitical goals, doesn't that sort of work against their own interests?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So this case of building poor infrastructure is not necessarily seen in like every part of the world, because if you think about it, that is just like another way in which like certain scenarios are like where that is applicable. But even if they don't do the poor infrastructure in other parts, they're still gaining leverage, right? Like with that military, economic, and just their presence. So don't take that as a like every bit of infrastructure China builds is terrible quality. It's just like in select cases, you can find examples in which that is true. That's a good question.
I have a question. Mm-hmm. What would a U.S. or Western counter to the BRI look like?
Okay, yeah, interesting question. So this was actually asked in the last session too, and I'll give you the same response. So I answered a question to this, and the main thing that I want you to think about is that we are seeing that China is able to displace U.S. hegemony because other countries are no longer taking our aid as a result. And if you have identified that as the key issue, you have to think logically, right? Like, so what then can the US do? Well, if Chinese infrastructure has so many of these holes, if they have like all these issues of like quality, labor regulations, like unstable repayments, if the United States provides themselves as a key alternative to China in these countries, like in these regions, whether that's in Africa or like in Asia and stuff, then those countries will be more inclined to take aid from the US. And so a Western counter to this would essentially be Western nations providing that infrastructure aid, but to make up for the shortfalls that China makes, and therefore countries will be more inclined to take the US, and then that'll decrease Chinese influence in the long run. Does that kind of make sense?
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, I think we're good.
Okay. If there aren't any more questions, we can shift from talking about how China is using its kind of debt trap diplomacy to kind of impose its own foreign power on the globe to what's going on in China itself. And what's super interesting is that while China, I think, and I believe, is the world's single largest creditor slash lender, which means that like throughout the world, China is the entity that the most people owe money towards, largely like from the US and from BRI projects. You hear this all the time. What's our debt with China? We owe so much money to China. What a lot of people gloss over is the fact that China has its own domestic debt problem, okay? And a lot of this isn't actually governmental debt, which actually spells some issues, okay? So let's take a look. China's debt is currently over 300% of its GDP. And GDP, if you don't know, gross domestic product, is the total amount of finished products or services and goods that are like sold within China in 1 year. So China's debt is currently over 300% of GDP, which is really, really large, okay? The latest number I saw was like 317% GDP, which is way higher than most well-off financial nations, okay? In the next 2 years, Chinese businesses will owe over $200 billion to foreign investors. And that's really important. That means that a lot of debt in China is not centered around in the government, okay? I don't know if you've been keeping up with economic theory or economic news lately, but there's a theory recently, modern monetary theory, which asserts that essentially government debt doesn't really matter. Because how can you default on a debt of American dollars, for example, if you are the only one that can print American dollars? That's basically the crux of the argument. So if it was a lot of governmental debt, well then China's government, theoretically, according to modern monetary theory, wouldn't be able to default. So there's this whole debate over whether like governmental debt is actually bad or good or whatever, it doesn't even matter. But what's not debatable is that if your businesses are in debt, that is a problem. And right now, a lot of Chinese businesses are in debt, okay? Defaults are rising, and if more companies really can't pay up, the government may have to intervene. And look, this second point's really important. It goes into what I was saying about the governmental part. Corporate and household debt makes up a larger portion of China's debt than other indebted nations, which actually take on more government debt. And that problem was explained just a few seconds ago, wherein government debt is manageable to some degree. But of course, if your business is in debt, something needs to be done or else your business just goes under, right? And since the Chinese Communist Party does have a firm grip on the economy, a sudden economic collapse is quite unlikely, because if like a huge business is in trouble of going under, the CCP can just inject capital into it because they have the power to do so. But that's not a situation you want to be in, right? They're essentially bailing them out. And if this wasn't a country in which the central government had so much power, if this was like the US, there would be a big uproar if they started bailing people out. There was already, remember that huge debate back in 2008? Many of you probably don't remember it, but it was when the US had to bail out the big banks, literal capital injections, largely because they were going under. That's what debt and bad assets can do to you, right? So China's debt is more a symptom of a larger cause. Why right now are corporations and households in China having trouble with their debt when all we've heard from the past 2 decades out of China, 3 decades, 4 decades really, is how well they're doing with growth. Like they're opening up, they're expanding their influence, they're imposing debt trap diplomacy. What's going on with China's economy? Isn't it fantastic? Well, really, the debt problem is a symptom of a larger flagging economy, okay? COVID-19 really set into motion an economic downturn in domestic China that was the largest since the 1960s. Okay, so ever since December 2019, when COVID-19 really started making the rounds in China, starting in Wuhan and then going around the mainland, an economic downturn was imminent. And we've seen that across the world, right? The economies all across the world are just failing pretty badly right now. But COVID-19 really just exacerbated and put to light a lot of cracks that kind of appeared earlier. Okay. In the past few quarters before COVID-19 hit, there had only been around a 6% growth. And that was down from double-digit numbers per quarter in the knots. And if anybody does not know what the knots are, that's what cool people call the decade between 2000 and 2010, because it's really weird to say 2000s. Every other decade has a cool name, 1950s, 1960s, 2010s, whatever. For that decade, it's the knots. And the reason is because, like, if you take the N out and replace the O with an A, aughts is generally used to refer to the first decade of a century. So I don't know, historians decided to be kind of cheeky with that one. But why? Why in the last few quarters has growth kind of been slowing before COVID-19? Well, there are a couple of reasons, okay? The first is the trade war with the United States. This is completely preventable, to be completely honest. This trade war was not in anybody's best interest. What happened? Literally what happened? This happened back in March of 2018, okay? And this happened straight like in the middle of an extemp season. So it was something like we all had to learn immediately. And really, it was just some like weird disagreement where Trump in March suddenly just imposed a steel and aluminum tariff. It was just really, really, really completely out of the blue. Nobody in the international community really even knew about it or could do anything about it. So the trade war in particular, yes, as Arjun said, Trump threw a tantrum and started imposing tariffs on China. Now, is that the most eloquent way to put it? No, okay? But that's essentially what happened, okay? Because Trump, as you know, practices a policy of isolationism, America first economic policy, some what we would call something that looks like economic populism, okay? The reason why Trump had started this trade war was because A, he doesn't know how trade works. We have a trade deficit with China, right? He thinks that's a bad thing. Is it though? No, okay? If you take a macroeconomics course, you'll understand that having a trade deficit with a country simply means that you import more from the country than you export to it. That means the US is just a net importer. That doesn't mean anything. It just means that we have the resources to buy more stuff from China and we manufacture less. That's just because the United States is shifting away from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. That's a fact. So trade deficits are bound to happen, right? And it's not even like, look, it's not even bad because think about it. What kind of currency are we sending over to China for their goods? We're sending over US dollars. And when China receives those US dollars, they can convert it into yuan, sure, but then they still have a reserve of US dollars just sitting there. What does that mean? Where do they have to put the US dollars? Back in America, which is the only place US dollars can be used. So trade deficit in and of itself is not bad. That's the first thing Trump failed to understand, right? Secondly, theft of intellectual property. This was actually something that was a legitimate concern. China has very, very lax intellectual property laws, so piracy, stuff like that, technology, that kind of stuff, that was a legitimate concern. But what happened was Trump went about it the wrong way, imposed tariffs, and this really hurts everyone because tariffs really are bad for free trade, right? And if you look at the scale of where tariffs have historically been an anti-free trade move that protects American workers. So it's largely like advocated for by like leftists and unions, really, what tariffs are historically been used for is to protect American workers. But in an era where our workers are no longer working in like steel or aluminum production, putting tariffs isn't enough to revive our manufacturing sector. Do you know what I mean? So really, it just hurt the few things that we were exporting to China, like soybeans and other crops, while not doing much to revive a manufacturing sector that there was no incentive for anybody to revive in America. So that's why it hurt both the American economy and the Chinese economy. It's a lose-lose. It was a huge ego measuring contest. It was, I mean, look, it's an ongoing economic conflict. It still hasn't happened. It's really just Trump, Xi, they just want to look like the alpha male, and everyone's losing out because of it, right? So that's the first thing. The second factor that kind of happened was a swine fever. So pork in China makes up around 60% of meat consumption. It's really big, okay? And I think late last year or like early last year, actually, or a few years ago, there started being this new strain of a swine fever, kind of a swine flu type deal that was like really making the pigs sick. So that was another factor that caused pork prices to shoot up, which was actually a big part of like poor Chinese people's budgets because they buy a lot of pork to eat for meat, 60%, right? And then other domestic issues that just caused the economy to go into kind of a downturn. And obviously, you might say that this is kind of expected, okay? Growth slows down as an economy gets more developed. But couple that with the fact that COVID is here, the trade war is still ongoing, and you kind of have this recipe for like higher debt and some cracks in the Chinese economy that may require some patching up later on. So let's talk about some of these domestic changes that I alluded to in the last point. What has happened in China recently that has been of note? Because you might get some questions about these. These are maybe a few years old, but they will have ramifications. And if I was writing questions, I might still ask about them, okay? First of all, president for life. I forgot the first little quotation mark before the P, but that's really interesting. In early 2018, Xi Jinping and the Congress of China, which is essentially a rubber stamping body. It has no function. It simply serves the president of China's ego. It's a Congress without any legislative power. Passed a constitutional amendment that would let him remain president past his 2-term limit. Most Chinese presidents only serve for two 5-year terms, so really 10 years. This would let him remain president past 2023 for as long as he wants. Now, this was done largely without a single murmur of dissent among the Chinese population and among the Chinese government. Now, the population is understandable. Heavy censorship in China, right? You can't really say stuff in WeChat. A lot of stuff is censored, so that's understandable. The government is just rubber stamping him, though. Largely because he is the most powerful chief executive since Mao. And can anyone give me reasons just in general why president for life is not a good idea in any circumstance, or some examples of people who have been ruler for life in the last century and a half and just
Hitler, Mussolini, Pinochet, Putin, Stalin, etc.
Yeah. Right? Okay, great. And how did most of these dudes get out of power? They were like either ousted, coup,
Shot while giving a speech.
exactly, man. I mean, come on. Just president for life is not good. This forms a cult of personality around him that allows him to do whatever he wants without any checks or balances. And this is exactly why many analysts are seeing that like the China and the US are moving into kind of a new ideological Cold War, because really our biggest threat or challenger or second superpower in the world is truly antithetical to the Western ways of democracy. And this is just another way of how they're showing it. Because look, Xi Jinping is really the one that ushered in all this antagonism and all this new reform Before then, Hu Jintao, who was the president before, was a technocratic leader, followed norms, followed traditions, stepped down when it was his turn, and then now Xi Jinping comes in and starts consolidating power. A very worrying trend, right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So with the new Hong Kong security law, it drove a lot of financial like banks and hedge funds and institutions out of Hong Kong. Why did Jinping take this move? Even though it secures his power, it made Hong Kong no longer the financial capital of Asia. So why?
Well, there are preface. I do not know why in particular or if Xi Jinping took into account economic benefits when making this decision. Here's what I do know. In mainland China, there's obviously things you can and can't do, largely dictated by the whims of what he wants. And even without Hong Kong, China's economy is second biggest in the world, probably biggest in the world soon, right? So it is very plausible that the millions of people living in Hong Kong, Xi Jinping would just rather have them, be quiet, be silent, be loyal, and risk losing out on some of that capital, especially if what he wants is to end the one country, two systems type deal and kind of assimilate Hong Kong back into the mainland. And you don't want you don't necessarily need them to be a superpower financial capital if you already have Beijing, Shanghai, and stuff like that, right? So once again, I don't know in particular, but it's easy to see why he would favor a city of that many people to just be quieted and dissent to be quelled, right? So on the topic of crushing dissent, he's released this manifesto, Xi Jinping Thought, which is really another great callback to Mao Zedong Thought, which is now being taught in schools nationwide. Fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Don't see any problem with naming a philosophy after yourself when you're still alive and then teaching it to other people as if it's gospel. Fantastic. But yeah. So how has he been quelling the opposition? So first of all, domestically, he has this anti-corruption campaign. Now, if you'll notice, and you do research on any country, developing country, developed country, and you start noticing these words, anti-corruption campaign. This is essentially a dog whistle.
Purge?
Yes, it's a dog whistle for purge. It is synonymous with purging political opponents. This is especially true if the country you're researching has a history of being authoritarian. When MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, came to power in Saudi Arabia, anti-corruption campaign jailed members of his royal family in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. I mean, it was comical, but it was to quell dissent. Similarly, anti-corruption campaigns everywhere, from the Soviet Union to modern-day China, have just been to quell dissent. Okay. In the same National Congress session that approved the removal of term limits, they expanded the Xi administration's anti-corruption powers. And this is reminiscent of purges back in the 1900s. And this targets lower government officials, generals, and most importantly, political rivals. Shortly after this was passed, two of Xi Jinping's main political rivals for really trumped up charges were just arrested and imprisoned for life. This is, simply put, not okay. You cannot lock up your political rivals. That's why it was so concerning when Trump made lock her up as such a big part of his campaign. And it's also why these anti-corruption powers are so concerning from mainland China. Okay. This allows Xi Jinping to consolidate power quickly and without dissent, and essentially cements him as an absolute ruler. And considering the fact that the Chinese government has total control over what can and can't be seen on the internet, across the airwaves, stuff like that, the people, if they do know about what's going on, don't talk about what's going on. And if they don't know about what's going on, will never find out about what's going on. Okay? this is why, like, in the Asian American community, Chinese American community especially, a lot of parents, because they use WeChat a lot, often have no idea literally what's going on in China from a Western perspective, right? And exactly, nothing happened in Tiananmen Square. I think June 4th, 1989 is literally blocked from the Chinese WeChat. You literally can't type it, it blocks it. So this is a pattern of censorship from the second most powerful country in the world, okay? That's concerning at best, terrifying at worst, especially considering our current trajectories. And it's very, very imperative that IXers, DXers, everybody understands what China's goals are domestically. What about Hong Kong, right? A new national security law was passed last month, as we touched on earlier in the presentation. Once again, gives China a vast security apparatus to crack down on any dissent or crimes. Once again, essentially just jailing and imprisoning political rivals and people who speak up against the government. Imprisoned for life. Also much harsher penalties as well. And the courts in China are not fair, okay, right? The courts in China, I mean, you're not getting a fair trial, okay? Jerome Cohen, professor at NYU, calls this a takeover of Hong Kong, which I was talking about earlier. You know, if you just take Hong Kong over, maybe you aren't necessarily too concerned about some banks leaving. And this new national security law was a direct pushback against the protests in Hong Kong, right? So last year, obviously, Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, faced backlash and was forced to suspend an extradition bill that would have allowed China to basically enforce its law inside Hong Kong. And the just massive amount of protests forced Carrie Lam, who is the chief executive of Hong Kong, to just not pass the bill, right? However, as you can understand, Beijing, not pleased, devised something else even harsher to create a security state of surveillance within Hong Kong. And especially with COVID, complicates things. Protesting is much harder. It just makes things look quite bleak. But that's not even the worst thing, okay? That's literally not the worst thing China has done in the past even few years, okay? Because the last thing I want to touch on is what I like to refer to and what many people in the media call like a hidden atrocity, okay? The hidden atrocity of what China is doing with Uyghur Muslims. They are essentially, and they are, committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. And people are like, Brian, are you sure this term is correct? Genocide. Yes. Yes, it is, okay? You can talk about labeling it as maybe cultural genocide, but under the definitions by the UN, genocide is appropriate for what's going on right now. So right now, there's a similar state of surveillance to what China is doing elsewhere in Xinjiang, or the XUAR, which is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It's a region way up in the northwest of China where really relatively few people live, but there's still big cities there, okay? Like the biggest city in that region is Wushi, but in I don't know how to say it in Western ways. It's spelled Urumqi. There's a different Han Chinese pronunciation, but it's a city that is squarely in that region. It has very good schools, and if you live there as just a Han Chinese majority person, you would be living good. It's fine. It's a great city. But if you're a Uyghur Muslim in that city or in that region, you are out of luck, because in recent years, over 1 million Uyghur and other ethnic minorities are being held in detention camps, okay? They're essentially sending them to detention camps, detaining them, torturing them, concentration camps esque, right? And Uyghur children are being sent to re-education daycares. They're literally just eating up Han Chinese propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. And under the definitions of genocide, forcibly separating parents and children of a specific ethnic group genocide. Also, forced sterilization and abortions, okay? Forcibly making sure that the targeted group cannot give birth or controlling birth rates within that group is also genocide. Along with separating families and re-educating children, these practices constitute the UN definition of genocide. This is, without doubt, just a genocide. And all talk about this campaign is silence. Journalists are just not allowed in, similar to Tibet. And if you walk in mainland China and you start asking random people on the street about what's going on with the Uyghur Muslims, A, you'll get arrested, okay? But B, they won't know. Only people who really live in that region have an idea of what's going on, and they'll have opinions on it if you dig really deep. But a lot of the time, they're also the wrong opinion, okay? A lot of them agree with what the Chinese government is doing. And that's really concerning because it's just another campaign to target ethnic minorities and stuff like that. So in recent years and in recent months, Uyghurs have internationally gotten together and tried to sue China for doing this. But China denies wrongdoing, A, because once again, no journalists are allowed in. The amount of some of the journalism that's been done is incredible, very covert. Some of the most stunning pieces of journalism I've seen. There are 2 Vice videos I recommend. If you just look up Vice News Uyghurs, they're fantastic, very covert, really tells you kind of what's going on, and they refuse to just recognize the jurisdiction of international court as far as China goes, okay? And that is it for my part on the domestic happenings in China. And Angela obviously talked about the BRI and what's going on outside of China. So if anyone has any last questions before we go for lunch.
This was a great lecture, guys. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, no problem.
The slideshow in the chat.
Huh? Okay, yeah, sure. One sec. I can do that. Okay, I'll stop screen sharing and then we'll put the lecture. Does anyone have any questions?
What do you think the Chinese ambitions are in like controlling the Uyghurs and just sort of committing genocide? Like, why would they risk condemnation from the international community?
Okay, first of all, condemnation from the international community means nothing, right? What we've seen again and again from Western countries, not even just in China, but elsewhere, Saudi Arabia, for example, killing of Jamal Khashoggi, is that condemnation means nothing unless you do something to back it up, right? Unless you act on your hard power, you don't have a dog in the fight. So as soon as the US and other countries start condemning, China keeps an eye out. And the US has condemned, okay? China keeps an eye out. Do they act on their actions? If no, they've just written China a blank check to do whatever they want. Same with Russia, okay? Russia literally executed a British citizen on British soil. This happened. Russia executed a British citizen on British soil. And similarly, if there are no actions, economic sanctions, if there's no trade punishment, what is the deterrent to stop China from doing it? So that's the first part. They're free to do whatever they want. So what do they want? China essentially is as a communist state, they're officially atheist. They don't like religion, so that's why the minorities, like Tibetan monks, Buddhist minorities, kind of persecuted as well. But also Uyghur Muslims, their religion goes against what China wants. And China put out a really ridiculous statement saying how we respect people to practice their religions. It's the most blatantly false thing I've seen. But basically, A, they want to control religion. B, the Uyghurs are an ethnic minority. They look different. They look kind of Central Asian, more like they're not Han Chinese, okay? They are Chinese, but if you saw one in the street today, you would not be like, that Uyghur is Chinese because they don't look like what a Chinese person is supposed to look like, right? And with the predominant majority in the country being Han Chinese, they really want to promote cultural hegemony. And of course, what I was saying before about Xi Jinping thought, the Uyghur children being re-educated, you can bet that they're being re-educated on Xi Jinping thought. They don't want any sort of separatist movements. And that's largely the excuse they made for going after them. The Uyghurs can breed terrorism and separatism. Has that happened? Not really. So really, China's just engaging on a campaign to further achieve cultural hegemony within its own borders, which leads to the really unfortunate and atrocious byproduct of committing genocide against a group of ethnic minorities.
Thanks again.
Yep. So look, I just found an article in late June. Trump says he avoided punishing China over Uyghur camps to protect trade talks. Okay? So, I mean, look, once again, China realizes that the West does not have bite because they have other things they want from China. So if there's no ability to follow up on words, China's free to do whatever they want. Same with Saudi Arabia, same with Russia, same with whatever, okay? If you don't back up what you say with what you do, it doesn't work. Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, I'll end the recording. I'll end the lecture. And everyone first, obviously, thank Angela for taking time out of her day to be here. Fantastic speaker, better person. So give her the Zoom clap, thumbs up, whatever. And yeah, as for right now, it's 12 p.m. Central Time. If you guys don't have any more questions, you guys can chill in the main room or leave the Zoom for lunch, and then just make sure to be back here a few minutes before 1 p.m.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye all. Yeah, of course.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye, Ryan.
See ya.
Bye.